Ex Nihilo. Talking to
Dear Philip Pilkington, welcome to Ex Nihilo. We're looking forward to today's conversation, especially since you're a macroeconomist who is unusually highly critical of your own discipline, which may have saved you from falling prey to the temptations of using computer models or celebrating the market's wisdom, or presenting yourself as an economic sage that is a modern shaman who solves the world's misery with a few chants. Instead, you've turned to examining it as a political economy. But first, let's say a few words about your 2016 book, The Reformation of Economics, which promised a deconstruction and a reconstruction of economic theory in its subtitle. Referring to Kant, you've questioned the scientific nature of economics, including the theory of the efficient market. What motivated you to write this book, and how did your colleagues react to it?
Wow, I haven't talked about the Reformation of economics in a very long time. It's almost 10 years old, and I was very young when I wrote it. I wrote that in response to, I went to university when the 2008 economics crisis occurred.
Yeah.
I wrote that in response to, I went to university when the 2008 economics crisis occurred. I was studying economics in Dublin at the time, and actually, funny story, I was also on the weekends, I was working in the property market. I was showing houses because my mother was working there, so it was an unusual experience. And it was very obvious to me that there was a housing bubble in Ireland. I mean, I was only 19 or 20 or something, but it was obvious that there was a mania going on. And my economics professors were telling me that nothing was happening, so I thought that was very strange. And so I spent a number of years studying economics, like really in depth, the theory, the econometric practice, all that kind of thing. I had an interest in philosophy beforehand, so I probably would have gone into philosophy if I hadn't been so inspired. And I came to think that the discipline was a little strange, a little off. There were a lot of epistemological problems, as we might say, with it, as you referred to Kant there. So the long story short, really, there was an attempt back in the wake of 2008 to try and reform economics in a sense. There was a lot of institutions set up. I think of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, INED, and so on. And there felt like a moment there when there'd be a mass questioning of the discipline, its premises, and so on. And I was very encouraged by that, and I thought it was. I thought I was part of the revolution or whatever, and it didn't work out that way. Actually,
it didn't work at all.
No, it didn't work. I think it was a massive dud. I ended up going into finance. I went into investment management after the revolution failed, I suppose. But I'd written this book, and so I published it with Palgrave. By the time I published it in 2016, I had pretty low hopes that there was going to be much reform in economics, but I published it anyway. And I think all the criticisms are pretty valid in it. I published it in my mid to late 20s, so it's a little bit of an immature book, maybe, although I think it's technically pretty correct. But it didn't have an impact. Economics today, actually, sadly, and we don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but sadly, I think economics as a theoretical discipline has basically collapsed today. Most of the mind, the talent there goes into econometrics and economic inference, which isn't a terrible thing. Although if you misuse econometrics, it can be awful in itself. But it's very sad today. I see back in before I wrote that book, or even when I wrote that book, there were big macroeconomic questions about what caused the Great Recession. What was wrong with the European economy? We don't really have those debates anymore. So I think actually what happened was the revolution failed, and in light of it, theoretical economics and economics itself, to a very large extent, has collapsed as a discipline. It's a pity, because I still think that macroeconomics is an important discipline, but I think it's kind of collapsed, to be honest.
What I really liked about your observations is how you approach the perils of our present in a largely non-ideological way. This has much to do with how you always see economic processes primarily as political ones. In a way, trusting in the neoliberal economy, indeed in the intelligence of the invisible hand, was the starting point leading to the 2008 financial crisis. On Ex Nihilo, we had a conversation with Thomas Mayer, who joined Deutsche Bank as chief economist around 2002 and was confronted with the surprising announcements that the bank no longer wanted to bother with business models and discussions, but only wanted to focus on securitized loans. In short, agency rating stamps have replaced real world engagement, a behavior that could be called psychotic, explaining why bankers have developed into a horde of risk-adverse lemmings, euphorically rushing toward the abyss. As someone who works as an investment professional, how do you see this history?
Former investment professional. I'm not currently anymore,
Okay.
but almost 10 years, so I can speak to it. It's true. What happened after 2008? There's a whole graveyard of 2008, really, and economics is the large crypt, I'd say. But there's a lot of other smaller graves, and one of them is, I think, what you refer to there, which is that in the wake of 2008. As I said, there was a lot of theoretical discussion. I think there was actually some very interesting theoretical discussion around the work of Hyman Minsky, financial instability, and so on, that remains extremely relevant to my mind. I don't think that's the last financial crisis we're ever going to see, for example. But the response, effectively, the compromised response of governments and institutions was to regulate. And there was a huge promise that regulation was going to solve all the world's problems. If you actually read Hyman Minsky, you wouldn't think that. He did not think that regulation would solve all the world's problems. It's much more complicated than that. But that's what they became convinced of. And in fact, a whole newfangled civil servant class that call themselves regulators sprung up around this in central banks, in treasury departments, and elsewhere. And yeah, I think the end result has not been to stamp down on financial bubbles. I mean, I think there's multiple financial bubbles in markets at the moment. But instead, as you say, to clamp down on risk-taking entrepreneurship and so on. Now, look, there's a debate to be had about how much risk-taking and entrepreneurship you want in financial markets. There are dangers there, and I think there are serious dangers there. But I don't think that what we've got is actually any better, and it is definitely worse. We haven't got rid of financial bubbles. I mean, the stock markets look insanely overvalued to me at the moment. We've seen multiple instances, massive spikes in volatility. We could talk about that if you want. I think housing markets in many jurisdictions are overvalued. I think that there's a huge bubble in private equity. I don't know how much details you want to get into on these things, but short answer is I think there are bubbles all over the market, just as bad as in 2008, maybe not quite as bad, but certainly of the same order of magnitude. And yet at the same time, a friend of mine who used to work in Goldman Sachs said to me a comment that I've never been able to forget when I was working in investment management. He said, since the regulations have come in, we're just overpaid civil servants. And we were overpaid civil servants, actually. That's exactly what we were. We were ticking boxes, we were going through hurdles and so on. But the portfolio construction was so constrained that there was no capacity for innovation. There was no original thinking. And by the end of my stint in investment management, I might end up back there, but at the end of my stint in investment management, I just thought I thought it was very boring, actually. I thought it was very boring, and yet still there was so much instability. So it had the worst of both worlds, in a sense. I even explored going into hedge funds themselves, which are known as a little bit more exciting, but even hedge fund themselves now, the way that capital's allocated in them is very much so in line with risk metrics. And just as I was leaving, on top of the risk layer that they put on top of the investment layer, an ESG layer was forming, which had a whole different. That was a completely I think that's been put to bed now. I think that's largely been deconstructed, but. Yeah, it just became I think in the 90s and early 2000s, it kind of might have been a fun sector. Whether it was a productive sector, maybe or maybe not, we could discuss that if you want. But it was kind of a fun sector. And by the time I left, I thought it was it was overripe. I thought it was a little overripe, and I think it's probably even worse today because that was 3 years ago or something.
But it's a little question, like the stunning thing was like the stupidity of the actors. For example, Alan Greenspan explaining all this risk mitigation, risk like handling, etc. All these algorithms are so complex that we don't understand them. It's quantum mechanics, etc. So he was just like saying, okay, my explanation is it's very a complex game, and we just the users, etc. So how do you explain that? I mean, stupidity, and on the other hand, you say we're masters of the universe.
So that was the pre-regulatory environment. Greenspan Greenspan was already juicing markets with interest rate policy. So there was already a form of government intervention in the markets when Greenspan was there. It was called the Greenspan put. But that was pre-layer upon layer of regulation. I mean, I always thought that stuff was... Having worked in it, look, I worked for a fund that pioneered many of the quantitative techniques. It was known as a quant fund. It went back to the 1970s. And I don't know why Alan Greenspan couldn't understand many of the things. The complexity
Really?
is
Very
slightly
slow.
It's a slightly false complexity.
I would say so.
It's complex in the sense that maybe a mortgage-backed security, it's very opaque what you've invested in. Sure. I mean, if you really put an effort in, you can figure out what you've invested in. But the basic idea of, for example, a mortgage-backed security isn't that complex. You can explain it in 2 sentences. It's a bunch of mortgages piled together. Some of them are riskier than others, and they're supposed to counterbalance each other. I mean, it's as simple as that. The slightly intimidating mathematical models that you see are of limited use a lot of the time. So I think Greenspan oversold the level of complexity, and I think he did so because he had an ideological axe to grind, which was basically that he was sort of a follower of Friedrich von Hayek, and Friedrich von Hayek's very interesting critique of socialist planned economies, which has to do with the capacity of individual agents to manage uncertainty in a much better uncertainty in information in a much better way than planned systems, is actually quite compelling. But I think a lot of people of Greenspan's generation had a very watered down version of that. I mean, he was kind of friends with Ayn Rand and stuff, and that was a very, I'd say, a kind of a lowbrow version of the slightly more highbrow libertarian theorist. What comes out in the wash is just Greenspan became kind of a front for Wall Street to go around to various committees and say, don't worry, you'll never understand. Just leave it alone, and leave it alone because vague Hayekian principles or something like that. So it was a comedy of errors, that whole financialization period, really, I think.
So you've commented on various occasions, quite rightly so in our opinion, on the political establishment, which is clearly a downfalling class. What's so striking about these people is their intellectual mediocrity, which, like Rachel Reeves in England or Annalena Baerbock in Germany, they can only overcome with plagiarism. Quoting Max Weber, we're dealing with people who no longer live for politics, but from politics, and who stand out as pretenders, as we say above with Annalena Baerbock and Rachel Reeves. What is particularly suitable here is the use of a moral economy, thus the working title that Rachel Reeves used when she concocted from every conceivable source the title that's DEA compatible, The Women Who Made Modern Economics. Given that you have identified Tony Blair as one of its first representatives, how could you explain the emergence of this political class?
You're absolutely right. It's an incredibly unusual class. It's in politics, people who went into politics used to generally have previous careers or previous experience. And the ones that were pure politicians, like you might think of Churchill or something like that, they were army officers or military or something like that.
Sure.
I'm sure you can come up with examples of pure politicians, but I think they're more rare. I'm talking about our current system. The previous quasi-aristocratic system in the 19th century is slightly different. But, the present kind of supposedly meritocratic system, people used to have careers, and even the politicians, the pure politicians, will come up from a very basic level, which they develop skills in and of themselves, of being a local politician, of dealing with people's immediate concerns and needs, and so on. And as you say, we've professionalized politics, and I don't really mean that in a good way. We've turned it into. I mean, just to give an example, I used to live in Britain for a very long time, and I think Oxford and Cambridge both run what's called PPE, which is philosophy, politics, and economics, PPE degrees. And I mean, I don't want to be too unfair to everyone who's been through a PPE degree. There are some smart people who go through PPE degrees, but PPE teaches everything and nothing, if you could put it that way. So you get politics, philosophy, and economics. Well, that's a lot for an undergraduate. Economics itself, like, to get good at it, you probably want at least a master's degree and 3 years of it. I'd say the same for philosophy. So, like telling these people that they can just get on this conveyor belt and know everything about politics, philosophy, and economics by the end of 3 years is kind of an absurdity in itself. Unless they spend all their private time reading, which I'm sure they don't. They probably end up in the bar in Oxford. So that's kind of a rubber stamping mill for these political actors. I'm sure there's something similar in the École Normale in France and something similar in Germany. But in America too, obviously, it's a lot of people go through political science majors and so on. I know pretty much how that works, Harvard School, all that kind of thing. And so we've created these kind of PowerPoint merchants that don't actually have a conception of basically anything. And they fall back. I mean, what do you do if you don't have expertise in anything? You fall back on fashions and fads and so on. So whatever the new thing is, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, whether it's, climate change, whether it's, I'm not even saying any of these things are good or bad. I'm just saying, like, they're social fads. Yeah, they're like fads, and you can cotton onto that fad and you kind of ride it for a while. I mean, I'll be honest, the Ukraine war became a fad as well. These are things that you just you jump on the bandwagon and you go with it, and it creates this class of people that are just sort of lemmings. I mean, in a sense, and there's no agency there. I think somebody somewhere called it swarm politics, where like you see a swarm of bees and the swarm it has a mind of its own, and you're not really sure why it goes right or left, but everyone goes right or left in the swarm. It seems to be some sort of collective intelligence. And by intelligence there,
stupidity, maybe.
Yeah, collective stupidity. I mean, it's like animal intelligence. It's animal intelligence.
Yeah.
It's herd intelligence.
Reptile.
Like why do all the deer run in the same direction? Like they didn't use their Cartesian reasoning to get to that point, and they didn't use critical thinking so they just go with it. And that's the class of people that we've created. Especially in Europe. I think the problem's less bad in the United States, although it is bad. But in Europe, this has been created. And I'll be frank, I think it's increasingly being used to manipulate politics to a very large degree by bureaucrats and people in security establishment and corporates. There's a whole public relations machine around many of these things, especially around corporates, for example, that just catch on to these trends and they're professionally paid to steer the swarm in a certain direction. So it's directionless. It's absolutely awful, but we've built it. We've created it ourselves in our university systems and in our societies.
I would take the topic of moral economy a little further. The name that stands out when looking at the early days of economics is Bernard de Mondeville, who in his own way anticipated Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand. However, we're not dealing with economic illusionism of things being worked out behind the scenes, but with a moral transubstantiation, which turns private vices into public benefits. That this was possible at all is only because the foundation of the Bank of England overcame the enemy of the 17th century, which Schumpeter calls the Kipper and Wipperzeit. Based on a reasonable, stable currency, economic competition could emerge. But nowadays, we see that good money can no longer be generated by nation states. Since Bretton Woods, markets began to float freely, and it's no longer clear what we really mean by money. Is it possible that this currency has been changed to attention? social media. In any case, one thing is for certain, namely the reversal of Mondeville's formula. After all, today's social game consists in the opposite, privatizing a public benefit and turning it back into a private vice.
You're discussing money in that regard. And
Yeah.
Bitcoin.
Money and attention.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big events of the past that shaped our world really is the exit from the Bretton Woods gold standard system in 1973, for sure. I mean, I think at this stage, now that we've been through the past 3 years, we're seeing actually that was the beginning of some very strange shifts in money. The end of the 1973 system was not the first time that we've seen fiat currency, of course. I mean, anytime you've had a major war, you've had a fiat currency. Anytime you've ever had a revolution, you've ever had a fiat currency. And I think there even exists some non-crisis era fiat currencies. But the hegemony of the US dollar was something else. It accommodated, first of all, enormous trade imbalances, the likes of which we've never seen as long as we have data. And I'm pretty sure we've never seen in human history, because just logically, people wouldn't accept paper for that long in exchange for goods and services. But in addition to that, money became a sort of a weaponized technology increasingly, especially by the United States. We saw that most recently with what ended up being extremely failed sanctions on Russia, but they were sanctions nonetheless. Now, the fact that they failed so dramatically gave us pause for thought. We only really think about a machine when it breaks down, I think is the good way of phrasing it.
Of course.
But these sanctions had been used for years. They became popular. I mean, you could almost go on a whole little history of sanctions. I mean, they kind of began with Cuba and so on after the Cuban Revolution, but they develop in such a way that they're used for almost anything as a tool of geopolitical leverage by the United States. Weaponization of money is just a bad idea. I think because money is based on trust, right? And a weapon is a tool of aggression. So you can't really have something that's simultaneously supposed to be based on trust and also a weapon. The only way that America got away with that for so long was because they were bullying, or I'm not even saying maybe the sanctions on Iran were correct. I'm not judging them morally, but I'm just saying that they were small enough countries that people didn't have to pay too much attention. And then once they tried it on a large country, it was a complete and utter disaster, and probably has reigned in the end of the US dollar in a sense. As a hegemonic currency, I don't mean the end of the US dollar itself. I don't think the dollar is going anywhere. But it was fascinating. I mean, it went in all sorts of directions. We're now having a big kind of quasi scandal about this USAID that Musk and them have shut down, and that's increased. That's a different form of, I wouldn't call that weaponization, but it's certainly a use of dollars to influence politics in other countries and so on. So I think this has been a very strange period. I'd be very surprised if there is another historic instance of, first of all, fiat currency being used for so long in spite of massive trade imbalances, and on the other hand, the weaponization or the utilization of that money thing for geopolitical purposes and political purposes that have nothing to do with barter and exchange itself. But I think it's that old Hegel thing about the Owl of Minerva, right? You can only really recognize it once it's over. I think the very fact that we're discussing this probably says that the era of that era is over. I think is probably over.
But is the problem of the end of Bretton Woods not something else? For example, you could say that capital is not at home anymore in the capitals of the world, meaning it has given the power to faceless world financial markets, which made kind of the emission of capital really a weird thing. Like, for example, the Euro crisis in the 90s was a weird moment because all of a sudden somebody like George Soros could say, yeah, the lira has been super evaluated, etc. So this moment of turning a nation state into a void, etc. And money itself getting kind of strange, because the other things the end of Bretton Woods meant the digitization, meant the networking of the market, is it?
Yeah, I mean I think they're probably separate. You probably could have had the end of Bretton Woods coincides with the development of the SWIFT system, for example, and I think the SWIFT system would have come along regardless. The end of Bretton Woods made it simpler, I guess, to do. But certainly, you're correct that the explosion of financial markets all over the world and the power that's being given to an investor activist like George Soros is definitely the result of the end of Bretton Woods. If there was some sort of a stable monetary architecture, whether based on gold or whether based on something else, it wouldn't even have to be commodity based. It could be rules based. But if there was some sort of stable monetary architecture, that would not have happened. And the reason that wouldn't have happened is because you'd have had some sort of fixed or managed exchange rates rather than the free floating exchange rates that we have now. I mean, you talk about George Soros. If he, back in his former days of being an investment activist in a sense, his method of attack was on currencies always. And so if those currencies were managed, that method of attack would have been much more difficult. But yeah, no, I mean, apart from giving rise to this weaponization of the US dollar, it also gave rise to a proliferation of money creation in a sense, decentralized and so on. But I think it still goes back to the geostrategic picture, because the reason that the Americans were willing to allow this, I think, was because they knew that no matter how many threads spun off the dollar in private hands, ultimately the Federal Reserve was supposed to be the boss in a sense. Now, the backstop, and so they probably had the last call in any crisis event or anything like that. I think 2008 probably spoiled the apple cart on that one. I think they started to realize that they'd created a Frankenstein's monster in a sense. But now with the potential end of the US dollar hegemony over the next decade or so, we're entering a completely different world. I mean, I think the changes that we're undergoing now are much more dramatic than the upheavals that 2008 reigned in. That said, 2008 was a canary in a coal mine for what we're currently seeing. But yeah, no, I mean, apart from giving rise to this weaponization of the US dollar, it also gave rise to a proliferation of money creation in a sense, decentralized and so on. But I think it still goes back to the geostrategic picture, because the reason that the Americans were willing to allow this, I think, was because they knew that no matter how many threads spun off the dollar in private hands, ultimately the Federal Reserve was supposed to be the boss in a sense. The backstop, and so they probably had the last call in any crisis event or anything like that. I think 2008 probably spoiled the apple cart on that one. I think they started to realize that they'd created a Frankenstein's monster in a sense. But now with the potential end of the US dollar hegemony over the next decade or so, we're entering a completely different world. I mean, I think the changes that we're undergoing now are much more dramatic than the upheavals that 2008 reigned in. That said, 2008 was a canary in a coal mine for what we're currently seeing.
Sure. But what do you think? It seems Bretton Woods happens about the same time the internet comes to life, and you have faxes that you can do trading with, and then you have online trading. All of this seems to add to this picture. At least that's our conversation. Martin, chime in here and rescue me.
We had an interesting conversation with Oliver Ballows, because you as an Irishman, know about your neighbors, etc. He wrote a book about the English financial market turning into the butler of the world. I mean, this weird moment, getting to the Cayman Islands. London became one of the biggest stock exchange market, really as a butler of the world, helping every criminal on the world to get his money away and to get onto one of these pirate islands. And it all began with a fax machine. First these guys had fax machines and they networked, etc. And without the internet, without all this a structural element of telecommunication, this would not have been possible.
No, you're probably right. Without it wouldn't have proliferated as far as possible. But the thing about financial markets have always been first adopters of technology. So just to give an example, the first underseas cable that is
Sure, sure.
telegram
course.
cable
Yeah, yeah.
from Britain to America was used to trade
course.
USD
Yeah.
GBP. To this day, if you go to the city of London and you want to trade the US dollar, you trade cable. They still call it
Yeah.
cable. So there were always early adopters of technology. I think it is an interesting counterfactual to think through. If you had the breakdown of Bretton Woods and you didn't have, the information technology revolution, what would have happened? Yeah, it probably would have actually been a lot harder to run as you say, the pirate island system that
I
Britain
would say so.
had until recently, without fax machines at the very least. I think it probably would have. You maybe could have done it through Telegram or something like that. But it's actually what people don't really understand, and actually the term cable for the exchange rate mechanism there alludes to it. Britain is actually really just. So first of all, as you probably know, the British economy is almost totally reliant on the City of London and financial services.
Yeah.
In a way of no other.
30% of the GDP. Yeah.
Yeah, and 30%, and then you have to the multiplier effect and living standards. Without it, it's Britain's pretty much not an economy. And what's really interesting about that is that it's not actually, London isn't an independent financial services sector. It's an offshoot of Wall Street. That's what it is. It wouldn't really exist without Wall Street. It's an island of Wall Street sitting off the coast of Europe. That kind of started. You're right. Some of it started in the 70s, but that really got its imprimatur in 1986 during the Big Bang under Margaret Thatcher, where basically the British reconceived of themselves as a financial economy because their industry was doing so poorly, and they saw no other thing to do. It ultimately kind of destroyed the British economy, but I don't know. You can't run a counterfactual. We can't go in a time machine, but. It is really interesting that the Americans basically sanctioned it. They had to have sanctioned the Big Bang and the development of financial services in Britain. They could have shut it down at any time. So that in itself was kind of a geostrategic question. And as we kind of enter the new world, if you see Britain completely panicking right now because of the events that are happening in the world and America pulling back and so on, it runs very, very deep. It runs right down to these financial services and so on.
Martin and I have been working extensively on the issue of the attention economy for several months now, and comparing this with the interest that led to the Homo economicus revolution in Europe, a strange question seems to emerge for us. While interest boils down to an essentially long-term commitment, the attention economy is very short-term in its nature, leading us to wonder if Kim Kardashian's butt is really the ideal piggy bank. Isn't the deepest reason for today's crisis that we no longer have a long-term conception of the future?
Well, yeah, for sure. Our economies are completely consumption-based, and as you alluded to, we're now so consumption-based that we've run out of things to consume, so we started consuming images and monetizing them. It's completely strange. This is completely unsustainable to my mind. I always think I might write an essay on this sometime because I think about it a lot. In economics, in macroeconomics, we have a term for capital development. So we call it capital widening and capital deepening. And you can imagine that capital widening is, for example, a bunch of farms and everyone's working them with sticks, and then you put tractors on them. But widening is you put tractors across all the farms, right? And so you've widened the capital base. Capital deepening is where you usually already have your capital widening largely done, and you start intensifying the efforts. So you might start optimizing the tractor, or you might come up with other tools that add to the productivity increase of the tractor. I think there's something similar to be said about consumption. So I'd say in the immediate post-war era, post 1945, we had consumption widening, right? A lot of the population was quite poor pre-World War II. They didn't have great living standards, and then kind of the kitchen revolution and all these gadgets come in, and that was kind of consumption widening. I think the standard of living went up immeasurably in that period in the West, and we're seeing something similar happen in China over the past 20 or 30 years. getting access to a washing machine, for example, running water, these kind of things are real, and they're real improvements in living standards. And back then, we'd measure that with the same metric that we use today, which is basically GDP, inflation-adjusted, CPI-adjusted GDP. And I think it basically worked then. I think when you said, wow, well, that person has more butter than they used to have, and they have a washing machine now, and they have a refrigerator, and they have running water, and their house is bigger, and they don't live in a single room with a family. Those are meaningful changes, and the measurements that we used at the time tracked those meaningful changes. But I think probably in the past 30 years, maybe even 40 years, we've seen this kind of consumption deepening instead. And we have all the gadgets. That's fine. We don't have that many more gadgets than somebody in 1985. I think, okay, we have the internet and everything like that. But really, we are just going home. We're using the fridge. We're using the oven. We're sitting down in front of a screen and watching it. Like, we haven't changed that much since 1975 in that regard. And we have a car, and it may be electric rather than petroleum. But, we're doing the same things as somebody in 1975 to a very large extent. But there's been this consumption deepening where what we're doing is we're making more and more aspects of our lives GDP oriented. So, everything that we do has to have a monetization attached to it, because of course the way that you measure GDP and the way that you measure profit and everything like that is that you need a transaction to take place. So if I'm doing something in my personal life that doesn't involve a transaction, there's no GDP generated. But if it involves a transaction, suddenly I generate GDP. And so the metrics that we're using have kind of gone off the wall a little bit, and the targeting of them has kind of gone off the wall too. And it leads to this extremely strange paradox where I think credibly, I'm millennial, I think. Millennials and Gen Z, the Zoomers, feel increasingly poorer than their parents. And they are. Now, their GDP is higher, apparently, their GDP per capita, but they can't get a house where their parents could get a house, and et cetera, et cetera. And what's happening is the GDP metric is taking into account all these, you'd almost call them quasi-rents, these little rents that you put into all sorts of things between you and, somebody who maybe didn't provide service for money before, or, use your imagination. And so these things are all being counted as GDP. And so we say, oh, well, you've got a higher GDP per capita. And at the same time, all the meaningful things that we were measuring between 45 and 1980 or something like that, 1990 maybe, those things are actually getting way more expensive. But I won't go into the technicals of how it's measured, but because we're putting more and more items in the consumption basket, we're saying, oh, you're much wealthier now. I saw a tweet the other day which said sleeping with your wife doesn't add to GDP, but hiring an OnlyFans model does. I just think that says it all, doesn't it?
Totally.
How is that? Our metric is not working if that is the case, because it goes back to Mandeville as well. You have to make you have to make a value judgment on quote unquote transactions at a certain point. But even below that, I think people are being hoodwinked, actually. I think they're being told that their living standards are going up. You consume more. It's like, well, I have a smaller house and food's more expensive. Yeah, but you consume more because you're on your phone and you pay for an app. Like, what is that? So we're in a very strange place right now. It doesn't feel sustainable to me.
I would say it's a very interesting position. I'm not really, being a boomer or a doomer, as you may say, myself, I would say there's a big change, which society's undergone since 75, etc. And it has to do with the dematerialization of goods, etc. So my son is he has been deep into econometrics and later on turned into data scientist. But he when he studied in 2008, etc., he saw something which was kind of astonishing to me. It's just, the economists were not only talking about goods but also about bads being sold, etc. Which means if we go back to Marx, and you read Marx as I know, we could say, okay, there's something like a use value of stuff. Is it commodity has a certain utility, etc. You do something with it. Like, but what do you do with Kim Kardashian's butt, which is like her own piggy bank, etc.? So you could even say that the use value has been extended, a widening of like production and consumption likewise, like to an abuse value. All of a sudden, like every scandal, every abuse, etc., turns into like an economic commodity as long as it is monetized, etc. And I would say this is really like a deep crisis of what I mean. The people, they're lacking even words to describe that. I mean, you were referring to images, etc., like to OnlyFans, etc., but that's driving our economy these days. Short time attention.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of my close friend Gladden Papin's phrase. I'm going to butcher it, but he says, I mean, he's referring to liberalism itself, but, you know, liberal economic relations it works for too, that liberalism is a system under which you engage in maximal mutual abuse without eliminating the other or violating the law.
It's a little bit like Kant's description of marriage. Do you know Kant's description of marriage?
It's
like the contract which allows the partner to use the sexual organs, the private parts of the other. Mutual, which is very funny.
Not to get too into European critical theory, but I recall that a psychoanalyst in France highlighted Jacques Lacan highlighted.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah.
Kant was actually de Sade's, you know, inverse or whatever. So the law can be quickly turned perverted or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of truth, you know, and that feeds into it. You know, I think that. I mean, my next book it's coming out in May, is on liberalism, actually, rather than on economic theory. It's on political. I mean, it has a very economic element, but it's on political theory. And I think a lot of the issues that we see them manifest in the economic sphere, but they're actually due to fundamental problems with our implicit political philosophy, because what we're doing, if you want to use Marxist terms, is we're reducing everything to exchange value. Now, I know that may sound trite. People have been saying that since the 60s, right? Or maybe even before, since cultural Marxism or something. Oh, everything's going to be reduced to exchange value. But I think people way underestimated how true that could become. And I think it's really only with the rise of these kind of smartphone technologies, that sort of thing, that we're starting to see just how profound that can be. That you really are. There is a drive for, you could say capitalist society, but I'd also say liberal society, to reduce everything to some sort of a contractual arrangement. And that can be a monetized contractual arrangement, or that can be some other form of contractual arrangement. But it seems that there's this massive drive. I think it comes from Locke and so on, but it definitely feeds into the economics, and economics becomes about 70 to 80% of the contracts, as it were. But what our societies are doing is turning everything into a contract. Everything possible has to be turned into a contract, and it's I mean, it's awful. I mean, you can't say anything else. It's awful, but it's also highly dysfunctional because of what we just talked about. That because it becomes an absurd system, like communism or something, where you're telling people, you know, like in like communism. I think there's an old Soviet joke where it's the guy comes back and he says to his wife, there's no toilet paper. It's terrible. We've run out of toilet paper. There's no toilet paper at the shop. And she turns around and says, but comrade, the newspaper says that there are many pieces of toilet paper. It's the same as that. You're being told as a younger person, your living standards are going up. Your per capita GDP is 40%, 30% higher than your parents' per capita GDP. And you say, I can't get a house. You're not telling me the truth. So when you have a highly, I'd say, ideological system, which is what I think late liberalism is. When you have a highly ideological system like late liberalism or like late communism or something like that, and it really tries to mold society in an unnatural way, you start getting these absurdities, and you start kind of living in, as the kids say, clown world. And it's like Soviet. I think it's very. I personally think we're in the same phase for liberalism as the socialists were for actually existing communism in the Brezhnev era.
80s.
Maybe even the Gorbachev. Yeah, early 80s. I think we're in the early 80s phase of liberalism at the moment.
I want to come back to this downfall of our political classes. Germany, and I can say this undoubtedly as a German, is the perfect example. Here we have an economy that has catapulted itself into a logic of deindustrialization purely only for moral grandstanding. Let's look at the energy transition set in motion overnight by Angela Merkel, which was done only for good press, base motives, so to speak, or private vices, if you will. First of all, the world's leading German nuclear industry was destroyed. Next, dependence on Russian gas was doubled, and the politicians weren't even deterred by Putin's Green Man invasion of Crimea in 2014, which made Germany, as some observers have rightly pointed out, finance the Russian war against Ukraine. Next was the destruction of the German car industry and the attack of German pensioners by entering the basements and forcing them to buy heat pumps. The most shocking thing, however, is that this insane energy transition wasn't even thought through as an architectural problem, because if you rely on wind and solar, you should have started by designing a smart grid as an energy internet. How do you explain this madness of the ruling classes?
I actually have a chapter on it in my forthcoming book. And
Okay.
so I think there's two components to this. One of them that I do discuss in the book, and then the other one, which I'm sure I've read. Oh, no, I did. I did an American Affairs article about it. So the first aspect of it is, again, I mean, not to harp on liberalism too much, but that's what the next book is about. I think liberal theorists vastly underestimated the need for religion in people's lives. Actually, religion, first of all, to have some sort of eschatological vision,
Sure.
and second of all, to have some sort of norms in your life that you live by. You can think probably like Catholics saying, signing cross before they eat or something like that. The more radical elements of the Green movement, not even the radical, I'd say almost the mainstream aspects of the Green movement, provide both these things. They provide an eschatological vision, which of course is if we don't do, it's heaven and hell in effect. It's if we do the bad thing, we all suffer in the fires of hell, I suppose, on earth. And if we do the good thing, we'll ascend to this heaven-like thing full of like dogs and puppies and rabbits bouncing around in meadows and stuff like that. And so that's the eschatological vision. And then there's even a kind of a practitioner aspect to it, which is you sort the recycling into various bins. By the way, I'm not against recycling; I do it myself. But you sort it into various
it's liturgical.
It's liturgical.
liturgical.
It is. Yeah. It's liturgical, and so that actually, I think that provides people, and like having watched people who've got really into the green thing. I mean, I think it's a bit pagan and a little bit strange. It's kind of tree worship, but I kind of respect it as a mode of being.
Religion.
Yeah, it is religion, and
Without
Of course
religion,
it is.
it quells anxiety, and and there are actually very religious elements if you go to the extremes in Extinction Rebellion and so on, where there is literally like quasi witchcraft. And anyway, it's very strange. If you go into
we
the
know
depths
this story well.
Yeah, I wrote about a little bit of it. One of the aspects is religious substitution, and I think it's been a very successful religious substitution. The issue with that is, especially, I mean, religion in itself can often be manipulated, but especially if that religion is a highly materialistic religion that's tied to actual physical processes in the world, where the heaven and hell depends on your, I guess, control over the weather or whatever they claim. If you do that, you just open the bag for scammers, actually, and so money will flow in. And I did an American Affairs article, I think about a year and a half ago, with Malcolm Chiune, that I encourage people to read. And it basically, we actually estimated everything. We went and looked at the lobbying money that was being poured into the Green movement in DC. But we also looked at how much they got out of it. So we looked at it from an input-output point of view. So for every dollar in lobbying, how much did they get in subsidies and tax cuts? And we compared it to fossil fuel lobbying, which has long been the bête noire of the left.
Sure.
And we compared them, and we said,
it's better.
Oh man, it was something like 100 times. You got 100 times more money if you went in the green lobby. And
I'm
what the
sure.
trick was, I think the trick was basically this, that previous to this, lobbying groups were seen as pernicious. Big tobacco, big oil, big food,
Mhm.
these kind of big ag. And a lot of the times they are kind of pernicious, I'm going to be honest. But the lobbying groups got themselves a bad name among the baby boomer generation, actually, especially. And what the Green Movement did for corporates was it allowed them to clean lobby. Green
Oh, of
lobby, clean lobby.
course. Of
And that was the
course.
trick. It's even got a
Mhm.
term now in lobbying. It's called greenwashing. You
Yep.
Yeah,
greenwash
yeah.
your product. So that's what it actually did. And so
Mhm.
it allowed corporates to engage with the government sector in a way that was immune from criticism. And it was immune from criticism because a large portion of the population had adopted a paganistic religion. Well, with rites, with
Yeah.
eschatological aspects, with
It's a
liturgical aspects.
polytheistic age, as we call it.
Still, the
Amazing.
question remains: why commit suicide for moral grandstanding?
Yes.
Oh, well, I mean, religious sects have always done this. I mean, if you classify the green ideology as a Christian heresy, which I think you probably can, you just go back and you actually find a very similar Christian heresy among the Cathari in the
Yeah, sure.
Middle
Gnostic.
Ages.
Sure,
There's certainly
The
Gnosticism.
Gnostic sects.
Gnostic elements, but the weird thing is
Mhm.
that you've got an apocalyptic sect, etc., without redemption in a way. Like, so there's no forgiving, there's no redemption. The man is the cancer on earth, etc. So there's not really a promise. So degrowth is a very, very sad perspective for a future well-being. Is it?
But yes, but I mean, the Gnostics were the same. They didn't want to reproduce, isn't that right? With the
Yeah, yeah,
Cathari,
yeah.
Yeah.
they
But
encouraged sterile
they believed at least
sexuality.
they believed that the soul would be, which is encaged in its sarx, meaning the sarcophag, etc., in its flesh, etc. But they believed that the soul would have paradise and be well off if it was totally devoid of any bodily aspect. And there's no green paradise, I would say.
No, and I think that's where it's a strange. I mean, the eschatological element in the heaven and hell aspect of it is very Christian, but
Yeah.
but you're right, the salvation isn't there, and so the lack of salvation is very paganistic. I mean, you could find that
Yeah.
even in Roman writers or something like that. But it's this mesh, but it's certainly a religious movement. I think
Yeah.
historians in the future will classify it as religious,
Mhm.
and it's one that's got. I mean, if you told somebody writing cultural theory or something in the 60s, a religious movement is going to get control over the energy grid, they just said, you're absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
That's never going to
That's
happen. But look where we are. That's where we are. It's crazy times. And it's been taken advantage of by commercial interests
yeah, sure.
who've
Of
been
course.
trying to figure out a way to lobby governments without having people turn negative attention on them for years. In fact, the very people, there's such an irony here, the very people who would have been protesting the lobbying by the energy sector, by the food sector in the 1970s, I'm thinking kind of the cultural left, are the very people who are lobbying for the corporates now. So it's almost genius, but I don't think any evil genius came up with it. I think it's just we've created a very strange society in the early 21st century.
Well, and it's very strange. I mean, we're both boomers, doomers, as Martin would say. And I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and Greenpeace and the Greens was just, it's where you would go. It was wonderful. And then come the NGOs in the 80s. And then it was weird how this all started to change. It kind of went around. And here we are today. If you take Kant's remark that history progresses with a cosmopolitan intent, we could say that something actually happened in Europe in the 1980s and 90s. That is, we got the euro and we got the Schengen Agreement. But today's EU doesn't strive for a more cosmopolitan version of itself. Rather, it looks for salvation in net zero and degrowth. And to this problem, irregular immigration is added. And when you get that, you understand why Europe is increasingly paralyzed. How do you explain this failure of the European elite?
Well, on the immigration issue, I do a lot of actual technical work on it because people are missing. And actually, this ties back to the green stuff, actually, in a weird way. The immigration issue is multifaceted, yes, but the underlying driver of mass immigration is not just in Europe, but in America as well, is low birth rates. So we need labor.
Sure.
And that's not the only reason. Now, for example, the refugee crisis had different origins. We all know what happened there. But I would argue that the premises that had to be normalized prior to the immigration crisis were immigration is generally good, and the reason that we have to think that is because we need immigrant workers, because we don't have sufficiently high birth rates. So
right.
that's a huge aspect. That's a huge problem for Europe. Now, it's more of a problem for Europe than America, because on our border, we have very poor, underdeveloped, and very civilizationally different cultures. Whereas in America, look, immigration's causing enough problems in America, I know, but at the very least, it's kind of like Christian Mexicans, who like some parts of those territories have been interacting with the United States for years,
Sure.
So it's in Europe, it's just more of a crisis. I'm not downplaying some of the aspects in America, but it's more of a crisis. But
you have to look at, with America, there's a difference between America and Europe. America, we enculturate our immigrants. In Europe, that doesn't really seem to happen so much.
Yes, but I mean, I know, and I used to live in America. I lived there twice, and I know that it's more. The moment you land there, everyone wants to turn you into an American. It's very striking, and it's nice. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but that's due to its history. But I even think with that, if you sent the same populations, and I'm not trying to be like racist or anything. I'm not being that. I'm just saying that North Africa is really poor, and the people are not well educated, and it's a low civilizational level. I don't mean that insultingly, but it is. And I think if you had the rates of Mexican immigration that you currently have into Texas or something, and they were North African, I think you'd have much more of a problem, even with the assimilation system. But but the underlying driver in all cases is low birth rates. I mean, in effect, and this is becoming increasingly clear. I mean, a lot of the reason that we're having such problems with government debt and so on are because of this low birth rate phenomenon. And I wrote a couple of things on what this means for the future of politics. I think it's actually very scary, because it's only getting worse as time goes on. You can already see intergenerational tensions in place now. And I would say the baby boomers had a significantly higher birth rate than the millennials. And by the time, and to Gen X as well. And by the time, I think 20 years out or 15 years out, we're going to have major intergenerational tensions in our society, for the very simple reason that every retiree, older person, whatever you want to call it, is a consumer, and they can't work. And so they're consuming. They usually have a pension. They require more in the way of state healthcare and so on. And the young people have to do all the work. Now, that's fine when you have a pyramid shape with a large base of young people. Yep. But when you have an inverted population pyramid, you have a very small number of young people propping up a very larger number of old people. And my fear with that is, first of all, it'll cause intergenerational tension. But I'm also I know this sounds extremely dark, but I think there's a lot of evidence in this direction. There is actually, if you think it through in the most brutal Machiavellian way, what is the solution to this? Well, the economists will come up with various solutions that won't work. For example, we'll extend the retirement age. That puts it off by a year or two. It doesn't truly move the needle. There's only two ways to actually deal with that problem if you have intergenerational tension and the younger people demand more of society's resources. One of them is to completely starve the upper end of the inverted pyramid of resources. And I call that the care home gulag system. So you have
yeah. Oh, good.
I know.
Here we go, awful. Martin.
But it's by the way, the baby boomers are going to miss out on this particular development. So lucky you guys. It's my generation that are facing the gulag. But the care home gulag, I mean, you can imagine it, right? You have a huge number of care homes all over society. They've ballooned. There's not many resources. Younger people demand that less of the social resources are sent to these. And so this system is starved of resources. And you can just imagine what that means. It could be horrific. Even worse than that, the other way of solving, quote unquote, solving the problem is something that's been normalized now a lot, is euthanasia. and forced retirement of people at a certain age. But the reason I raise this is because those are the only two hard solutions. Now, I do not advocate either of them. I think it's horrendous that even thinking a society like that isn't worth having, in a sense. I'd much prefer to starve the young people of resources personally. But I'm just saying that history does have a logic to it, and often it's an economic logic, and the economic logic there is militating toward that. I'll also highlight that it militates towards ending democracy, because older people, there'll be more older people, and older people are more inclined to vote. And we're already seeing that, for example, in Britain with these debates over triple lock pensions and so on, that the young people are getting really angry because they're saying, inflation's driven my living standards down, but the older people are allowed to lock their pension to the CPI. Now, that's only a very minor issue, but that's economic distribution. That's Marxian distribution. Think about that. The older people get their living standards floated because it's pegged to inflation, and the younger people who are working don't see their wages pegged to inflation. That's a redistribution of resources to the older people. So the other impulse there will be to say there's too many of these old people and they vote too much. Well, therefore, we have to abolish democracy because it's not fair. So I don't think we've even begun to think through the implications of an older society, and mass immigration as a stopgap solution to fix it is only the first manifestation. It's a scary situation, actually. And so I've written a lot on pronatalism and stuff like that. But I think even if we start to get the right policies in place, we're going to have a couple of generations that are going to have it very hard. And I hope that they can maintain their human decency actually in this, and recognize that you're better off being a little bit poorer than, turning into Oedipus and murdering your parents.
I would doubt a little bit that the birth rate is really the problem. In a Marxian sense, you could say, okay, we need additional people, etc., to extend our workforce or to uphold our workforce, etc. But the funny thing about our digital revolution is, then I wrote a history of digitization, etc., and really got deep into the philosophy of it all, is that if you take the Boolean formula, and which applies for the 0 and the 1. And if you formalize it, it says x equals x to the 1, meaning every good which is digitized turns it to be superfluous, etc. Meaning this means that every work which is digitized or electrified turns into a program later on, and it can be distributed all over the world, anything, anytime, anywhere, etc. Meaning it's a big crisis of labor. So workforce problems of this kind that you're describing could be easily solved with digitization, etc. So I would say it's even weirder. For example, in Germany, the big problem is a lot of people not wanting to accept digitization, pretending to do their work instead. For example, the education system, etc. So it's much more like a simulation of work than real work, which is taking place.
So this goes back to so just to give it a little bit of economic, not theory, but I guess it's theory. There are two components of GDP in the long run. There's only two ways that GDP can grow. It's labor force growth and productivity growth.
Sure. That's why I was alluding to.
Right, x equals x to the n.
Yeah, and so digitization is productivity growth, and so that's the idea. The issue is that there's a very famous problem in empirical economics, which is called the productivity puzzle, and was first highlighted by Robert Solov, who's the founder of productivity theory in a sense, and it can be summarized in a phrase that he said in the late 1990s, I think. You can see the digital revolution everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And what he meant by that was the first phase of the digital revolution, which I think is actually more profound than anything that's coming. That was the adoption of fax machines, widespread cell phone use, mobile phone use, internet, early internet, personal computers, which I think was huge. Search engines. I think search engines are actually a more important technology than AI personally, but I might be wrong about that. But the point is that even with the introduction of all these things in the 80s and 90s, we would have thought, as Solov said, you would have seen productivity go through the roof. No, it slowed. It was about half what it was in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, I have some idea. It's called the productivity puzzle because no one's been able to solve it. I have some ideas. I don't think these things are as productive as people think. I think manufacturing's the center of all production, but Marxist in a sense to the core. But But the point is that what we're implicitly betting on, if we bet on what you're saying, is a massive increase in economic productivity. That is the labor force, that we can offset the labor force shrinkage with productivity increases. But all the evidence shows the productivity has been slowing down since 1945 consistently, secular trend, and nothing's reversed it. So you can't be sure that a trend isn't going to turn around. But I'd say economists would say the weight of evidence is against a very strong, sharp uptick in productivity. In fact, I think there's good reason to think that in an aging society, productivity declines will increase because you'll have a less dynamic society.
I would say like
just the last thing, and
Sure.
so the last thing is that services are notoriously difficult to increase productivity, and so there's an old phrase among economists that that the productivity of a hairdresser never goes up. If you go into a hairdresser today,
like a teacher.
So there are certain jobs in which productivity increases are very, very difficult, if not impossible. I would definitely say that staffing a care home is not quite a hairdresser, but it's more a hairdresser than applying capital to a factory. You know.
I'll give you another example. Like take like for example, the record production, like in vinyl records, etc. of the 80s. Like you needed a lot of like oil. You needed a lot of like material stuff, etc. to produce a record. Is it like a music record, etc. Like everything's now turned onto digital, etc. And everybody has like collections like mad, etc. I would say here's like a weird moment, like in the 1970s, 80s, actually buying records, going to a store like that would lay down like as a statistical element in the GDP, etc. Downloading something for free, X to the N, anytime, anywhere, any place, etc., is not really metricized anymore. We have so many things for free. We could have even more things for free, etc. So this is a real crisis. I would say like it's like I wrote about the like revolution of like 68, etc., because it heralded not only the ending of Bretton Woods, but also the internet's beginning, the trading of software. That is the dematerialization of our goods. Just as a Harvard commission presented a new definition of death, namely that you're dead when your brain no longer functions. It seems to me that something like a cultural brain death has taken place. Only that most of our contemporaries still haven't heard the gunshot. That's why I chose the motto for the book I wrote on this subject. Imagine there was a revolution, but nobody was there. Hasn't the crisis of capitalism primarily had to do with the fact that we no longer know what a nation, what money and work are? That we've slipped into a major crisis of values where the world's leaders have no better idea than great again? Isn't that the problem? Going back to the past instead of going to the future?
Well, I think people have completely lost faith in their societies and their nations, for sure. I think that probably explains why you have such a low birth rate, for example. I mean, the one country in the world that has high developed economy and a high birth rate is Israel. It's Israel. And why is that? Because Israel is, whatever you think of the country or whatever they're doing there, it is a nation under siege, quote unquote. It's surrounded by enemies. It's on a constant war footing, and it has high birth rates. And some of that can be explained by the ultra-Orthodox and so on, but not all of it. Even fairly secular Israelis have, I think it's 2.8 birth rate for relatively secular people living in cities. So you need to, I think that all these things are connected. To me, the birth rates are they're very complicated. I mean, I know an awful lot about it because I've done a lot of empirical research on it. But when you strip it all back, you're not having kids because you don't believe in the future. I mean, that really is the long and the short of it. And you don't believe in the future because, you know, that stems from the same root as you don't really believe in your nation, and you don't really believe in. I'm not saying you have to believe in progress. I don't think I'm someone who believes too much in human progress as much as other people. But, you know, you have to have some sort of. You don't even have to. I don't think you even need to believe that your life situation is going to get better. I think that your average peasant living under feudalism, or even a knight or something living under feudalism, thinks that you're just going to have continuity. But you have to have some sort of optimistic or positive valuation of your society, in a sense. We've tied that up with progress. but you don't necessarily have to. But we seem to have lost all that. It's very, very strange what's been happening. It's a complete collapse of positive valuations of our civilization, in a sense.